Hello and greetings to all member states and UN and international agencies and colleagues. I'm speaking on behalf of Third World Network, the Financing for Development Civil Society Group, as well as the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development. Excellencies, addressing systemic asymmetries within the international financial and economic architecture is the very foundation of financing for development since its inception in Monterrey. And indeed, a systemic approach has never before been more urgent for global governance as it is today. A convergence of crises from pandemic, war, economic downturn, food insecurity, climate change, and gender inequality engulfs our interdependent world and seriously threatens the SDGs. As fiscal policy space for development keeps shrinking and debt crises, food and fuel price inflation, and higher costs of financing in an uncertain global economy keeps accelerating, the principles of distributive justice and equity for developing countries across the South in relation to historical and structural drivers of inequality among nations is more important than ever for the world's most vulnerable. Throughout the pandemic, liquidity provision and fiscal space for most developing countries has been severely shortcoming, despite the fact that the lion's share of the $650 billion issuance of special drawing rights went to countries that needed it the very least due to inequitable IMF quota allocations. SDRs was still by far the most effective international community response for pandemic recovery in developing countries. At least 99 low and middle income countries have reportedly used 104 billion SDRs for urgently needed health and economic recovery needs, such as vaccine purchases, health, and social protection. More systematic consideration of SDRs is required, both as an instrument for responding to global crises as well as to address asymmetries in monetary and fiscal support tools between developed and developing countries. Civil society urges that rich countries fulfill their pledge to rechannel their unused SDRs in alignment with principles such as avoiding the creation of new debt, policy conditionality, additionality to aid commitments, and a more equitable allocation formula so that SDRs go to countries that need them most. Civil society also calls for a new allocation of 2.5 trillion SDRs, as is warranted by the continuation of the pandemic, as well as economic shocks caused by the war in Ukraine. The FfD Forum is well placed to further develop proposals already made by UN and IMF staff, as well as member states, for the broader use of SDRs in both development and climate finance. Furthermore, food and fuel price inflation threatens a fragile pandemic recovery, adding to the 100 million people, in particular women and children, that fell into poverty since the pandemic began.
Unfortunately, the technological trigger that brings you to a close. I'm sorry,
Okay.
It's only 3 minutes. I hope we can have your statement also available online. My apologies.
Okay.